Welcome to another edition of George Washington Speaks. I'm Tom Saffold. In the previous edition, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, and the colonies rejoiced. However, they did not expect what happened next. Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which essentially declared that Parliament had the absolute power to do anything it wanted in the American colonies. No representation required. Many colonists recognized this betrayal of their freedoms and rights as Englishmen and wondered how it could get worse. Listen as George Washington, portrayed by Vern Frickholm, described the impact of the Declaratory Act and the laws that followed on the American colonies.
The Stamp Act was repealed in March of 1766. We can't know for sure if the repeal was due to Dr. Franklin's testimony or not. But I think we can confidently say that his testimony was a true representation of what we were experiencing and how we felt. The repeal was received with great joy here in the colonies, but what we didn't realize was that the King and Parliament had passed another act at the same time, another act that changed our relationship with a mother country. They passed the Declaratory Act. This act was forthright and said that Parliament had the absolute power to pass any and all acts over us that they wanted to, without talking to us or consulting with us to better understand our situation in the colonies. That is, without our representation. The act was not meant to hear from us, it was meant to silence us. They declared that they were the sole judge of what they would do or what they would not do in the colonies. In that one act, they threw out our sacred right as Englishmen to be locally represented. In that one act, they became what we feared the most, not our mother country, but a tyrannical government unconcerned about their subjects. We wondered, no, we dreaded, what else could they possibly do to us? Well, after 14 months went by, we found out what else they could do to us. Parliament passed not one or two acts, but a series of 5 acts called the Townshend Acts. 4 were all passed in June of 1767, and 1 was passed in July of 1768. The first act was the New York Restraining Act. Its chief purpose was not to govern the colony of New York, but to punish it for not obeying the Quartering Act that they passed 2 years earlier. The second act was the Revenue Act, which was a direct revenue-producing tax on the sale of paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. It also replaced the customs agents that were appointed by the colonies with British-appointed agents, which Parliament would then pay. In that way, they felt, and rightly so, they would have more control over the agents, and the agents would be more apt to remain loyal to Great Britain. But the act didn't stop there. It also gave the agents broad authority to enforce the payment of the taxes, to punish smugglers, and to search private property for smuggled goods using legally approved writs of assistance and search warrants. Now, typically, search warrants would be issued by the courts for specific situations that identified individuals by name, by location, and were in effect for a short period of time. However, these search warrants were unspecified blanket warrants, which were approved for general use without naming names, without naming locations, or even identifying what laws were broken, and they could last for as much as 1 year. But beyond that, they could be used anywhere, at any time, against anyone, by any government official, for no identified reason. Why? This would make them totally open to manipulation, bribery, and fraud by each of the customs officials. And how did we respond? Why, we loudly declared that the searching of private property was a threat to our rights as British subjects, since the right to be secure in one's private property was an established English right, along with the right of representation. How did the royal governors respond to our concerns? Why, they were ignored, and the abuse by the colonial custom officials went unchecked by England. The third act was the Indemnity Act, which reduced the taxes on the British East India Company. This act was not a big issue at the time, but it caused problems 6 years later. The fourth act was the Commissioners of Customs Act, which created a new customs board for the North American colonies in Boston, and which replaced the board in London, 3,000 miles away. On the surface, this appeared to be a convenience for the colonies, but it actually was designed to quickly enforce the fees and duties on imports such as tea, and to increase colonial compliance, and thus to increase revenues for the government. The fifth act was the Vice Admiralty Court Act, which aided in the prosecution of smugglers. This act went around the long-established existing laws and taxes in the colonies. It gave the Royal Navy courts, rather than the colonial courts, control over all matters of customs violations and smuggling. But that was not the worst of it. These courts were conducted by judges that were appointed by the Crown and who were awarded 5% of any fine the judge levied. Now, I repeat, and I want you to understand this. When a particular judge found somebody guilty, the judge was paid 5% of the fine he levied. Think about that. You can understand why we felt that they were not awarded a 5% fine, but they were rewarded a 5% bounty for finding any colonist guilty. But even worse than that, the decisions were solely made by the judge. There was no jury, no group of colonial peers making the decision of innocence or guilt. We considered that provision to be a third violation of our fundamental rights as British subjects. As a protest of the Revenue Act and the Townshend Acts in general, merchants in Boston once again enacted a Non-Importation Agreement, which proved to be so successful against the Stamp Act a year before in 1765. Simply put, merchants and colonists would not buy imported items that came into the colonies, and if no one was buying their products, then the English wholesalers would not be making a profit. We anticipated that the wholesalers would once again put pressure on the king, and Parliament would repeal that particular provision of the Townshend Act, if not all 5 of the acts. The Non-Importation Agreement led to certain skirmishes between the citizens of Boston and the troops that were stationed there. Those clashes heightened the tensions that were existing as the result of the Quartering Act of the year before. As a result, there were more instances of violence between the citizens of Boston and the English troops. It is true that the Sons of Liberty were involved in some of the larger incidences, but it was also true that the individual citizens of Boston were feeling the ill effects of British soldiers living in Boston. As a result of the Non-Importation Agreement and the higher tensions arising in Boston, what did Parliament do? Why, they helped the situation, of course, by moving 2,000 more troops from Halifax, Canada, into Boston in order to keep the peace. Well, with more troops to be quartered and visible, the confrontation between citizens and the British troops increased. Imagine that. Although Parliament was focusing on Boston as the main source of discontent and rebellion, merchants in both New York, Philadelphia, and other port cities had also embraced non-importation agreements. However, the South also was approaching non-importation in a very Southern way, which we will note in our next edition of George Washington Speaks.
This series of laws raised taxes and increased British enforcement, which the colonists had handled independently for many years. Their right to representation as loyal Englishmen was stripped away. These changes created a strong reaction from the colonists, who began to work together to oppose the new laws. These efforts at unity, which began in the 1760s, would develop over the next 10 years into rebellion against Britain. The colonists agreed not to import British goods which carried high taxes, but to produce what they needed, or do without what they couldn't produce in the colonies. The Non-Importation Agreement is the subject of the next edition of George Washington Speaks.